lion pictures behind me, I'm so glad they're just pictures. Because they're kind of looking directly at me and you. It took an angel to shut their mouths. It's what the Bible tells us. God sends an angel, shut the mouths. More or less, they didn't just acquiesce or Daniel had some magic spell over them. It took supernatural power to shut down what the natural would normally do. The natural would normally eat you.
Mm-hmm. They were hungry.
The supernatural said, close your mouth.
Yeah.
And it closed the lion's mouth. So I can just see an angel there. Literally, it says, shutting their mouth. More or less, their mouths were open, ready for Daniel.
Yeah.
And the angel shut them.
Wow.
So imagine the lions coming toward you, open-mouthed, and all of a sudden, an angel appears and bang, his hands just... Isn't that quite an amazing picture?
So amazing.
Today we want to talk about faith and fear. Mm-hmm. And we want to dive a little bit deeper because it's really pictured in here really, really well.
Yeah.
And I think we want to distinguish a little bit between the acts of, let's say, fear or even faith versus the direction of faith and fear.
Yeah, I think when we're looking at faith and fear in our own lives, I think we can all say that we have done things in faith and done things in fear. But when you really choose faith, it actually directs your path. It sends you in a certain direction, and it requires pushing aside fear and really stepping out in faith over and over again. It sets your life on a trajectory. And the same can be said for the opposite. When you're really choosing fear again and again, and sort of, you have to push aside faith in order to do that, you can be quite entrenched in it, and it can send your life in a certain direction.
Yeah, and I find when a person, well, even if we're on we'll say we're on a trajectory of faith, when we do have those moments of lapse and we act on fear, I find often what happens, and I've seen it in my own life, where it's a self-preservation type thing, but it usually bleeds out onto other people and ends up hurting or damaging other people along the way. And so like a life that's in that fear trajectory, it's just collateral damage all the time, because they're just always, they can't even look out at other people. It's just focused on self-preservation.
I think one of the things to look at in Daniel's story and to get clear about is two men. One is King Darius and the other is Daniel. And their response to the idea that judgment has come down and Daniel's life is forfeit by the practice of his worship of the one true God. So you got two different responses. Daniel goes and prays.
Yes.
He opens up the shutters publicly and prays.
Yeah.
The king, he got nowhere to go. He got trapped. His ego trapped him. And so what he does is that he gets all filled with anxiety.
Yeah.
The Bible actually tells us this. He's just absolutely on edge about this whole deal. In fact, he doesn't sleep all night. No entertainment is brought. His palace and all the nobles don't show up. There's no party, guys, tonight. Nothing. You guys have played games with me. There will be no party. And he's just filled with all of this anxiety and fear.
Yeah.
He can't even eat.
Fear. He's on, why I want to point that out is because he is on I want to say journey or a direction of fear. And with maybe a few acts of faith.
Yes.
That's kind of where a lot of Christians would be, on a direction of fear, and have a few acts of faith. Where you want to be on a direction of faith, and you're still going to have a few acts of fear.
Yeah, we talked about Peter, right? And when he steps out of the boat, like he was on this direction of faith, but then as he started to sink, fear had kind of captured his heart. It was an act of fear, and yet we can be resilient from that. What's our response? Jesus, save me, and then we can be resilient and recover from that. That's different than being kind of entrenched in fear, and the majority of your decisions are coming from that core, which is where the king was at. In the morning when he ran to call for Daniel, it said he had anguish in his voice as he's calling for him, and And that's how he spent the night. He was in anguish because this was his life. This was the trajectory he had taken.
Yeah, anguish would tell us that he feared the worst happened, right? Anguish tells us that he's already he's surrendered to it.
Yeah, although it was Daniel in the actual den.
Yeah, exactly. But there's like that tiny little glimmer of, well, maybe Daniel's God did save him. So there's that tiny little faith seed that...
Yeah. Maybe there was something to what this Daniel guy was doing all the time and talking about all the time.
You know, there's a comet that comes and circles famously the Earth from time to time. Halley's Comet.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And a comet's an interesting thing in space, because what a comet does is it's going very, very fast, obviously.
Yeah.
And it sucks any other space debris or anything in behind it.
Right.
And it brings it, because it creates this thing in space that it just brings stuff right in behind. It's the same thing in, you watch anything where you've got something go ahead strong, it draws in like a vacuum cleaner things in behind. When we talk about a direction of faith versus just acts, we're talking about setting a direction that's like a vacuum cleaner. It sucks in your intimate life. It sucks in your financial life. It sucks in every challenge and every part of your life. It gets brought in behind. Now, if that comet of your life is faith, that's good.
Yes.
That's good. If it's fear, that's bad. And that's why the direction matters more than just an act here or there of faith or of fear. And is because it really, it's got this drawing power and controlling power over all of these other things.
Yes, and I mean, we can see through this king's decision making and even just making this decree, right? There was a fear behind it, right? A fear of maybe people not worshiping him, of the power loss, whatever that was. I mean, everything was sucked into that fear journey, as opposed to Daniel's faith life, where we see it was an immovable faith. It was, everything in his life was consumed and directed with that. There was a flow to it that was always strong in his faith walk.
Yeah, and we discussed in our prep for this that the longer you go in one direction, whether it's fear or faith, the more difficult it is to come out of that or be pulled out of that direction. And Daniel, from the get-go, when he was a young teenager, began that journey really with the giving up the meat and the wine from the king's table. And then as you follow kind of his life, the highlights of his life, I guess, it just shows that by this time, he knew the direction of his life, and this is a hopeless situation, but he didn't let that stop him from acting in faith.
Absolutely.
Some of the other stories that would match up, and you mentioned Peter. Jesus comes along and he calls Peter to leave his fishing nets. Well, that's leaving his generational training. It's leaving his village in a sense. It's leaving his skills that he had developed and fine-tuned. It is leaving a lot of leaving involved in this. And he grabs onto it because he wants to follow Christ. He chooses a direction of faith.
Yeah.
In choosing that direction, he still has acts of fear. We've talked about the one. Right. The fear there that he got out of the boat, which was fantastic. That's part of his whole direction. Everybody else was still in the boat. Don't forget.
Right.
He gets out and he's walking and he's putting his God on display.
Yeah, he is.
Which is beautiful. Remember we talked about that.
We did.
Faith actually really shows off God. And so you got this idea of he did this act. He sinks because his heart gets filled with the fear of the storm. And then you see he gets saved easy because he's on a direction of faith. Then you see his denial.
Yes. Yeah.
That wasn't, that was because of fear and the motivation. It was an act of fear.
Yeah.
And then but the direction of faith is what ruled in his life.
That's right.
And brought him back into the acts of fear, and now becoming being dismissed, and his life becoming a testimony as an apostle.
That's right.
To the resurrection of Christ and change the world.
That's right.
So you find this in so many stories. It is the direction of faith that's the most important thing that people need to choose. Christian, you can choose a direction of fear.
Yes.
You can, instead of a direction of faith. We will all have acts of fear or acts of faith, no matter which direction we choose as Christians. But if you choose a direction of faith, Those acts of fear are points at which God only strengthens you, saves you, lifts you up, makes you better.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that's a really cool part of how God works in our lives, is when we do make those mistakes and we do have those moments of where we act on fear, we have the opportunity to come out of that with him making us better for it, refining us, I guess, eh?
Yeah,
It does.
It's an opportunity for him to show off again, right? By saving us
And his grace.
Yeah, and you know, I have been in friendships with people who I see just making more and more of those choices where eventually it becomes this direction of fear, and leading their families in that way and their finances in that way, and how very destructive it is. But we've also seen the flip side where people have stepped out of that and started walking in that faith and denying the fear and walking more and more in faith, and where those acts of fear then just become that acts of fear. Jesus saved me, and stepping forward in faith. And it's such an amazing journey and such an amazing testimony to walk with someone through.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It is.
I've seen that as well, and I've had people come into the church here who can't even look me in the eye. I don't know the reason, whether it's fear or shame or whatever their background is, and I've watched them go through a process of unentrenching that fear and growing in their faith, and often through Celebrate Recovery, and then showing up Sunday mornings, allowing God to do his thing. And they're some of the most joy-filled people by the end of that. I shouldn't say by the end, it's an ongoing direction, but you watch that direction change from fear to faith, and there's nothing more satisfying than to see that.
Freedom, yeah.
So one of the things I think I'd like to close this segment off with is to talk to you directly about the times that we're in right now. Dealing with the virus that we are right now, and how society is becoming very much a direction of fear. And how this is taking society not into just acts of fear, but directions of fear. You see it.
Yeah.
And I really want to speak to you as your pastor and say, don't get caught up in the world's ways on this. Fear direction is not where you want to be in dealing with anything, including this. That doesn't mean that you are not going to have some acts of fear. It means faith is going to stay in charge of my life. And I'm trusting God in all of these ultimate incomes.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we also go in a direction of fear, our hearts, our minds are so open to the messages of fear that we can't hear truth. That we cannot hear a balanced thing about how our lives can be lived out in the middle of these times.
Yeah.
Daniel was clear at all times. How come? His direction was set. He trusted God no matter what he faced. And you must stay in that same zone. Don't, as this world now has chosen such a strong directions of fear, get caught up in changing your direction, Christian.
Yeah.
You stay in faith. Heaven rules. God is in charge.
Yes.
And you can trust him in it. And even when you have some acts of fear in your journey of faith, he'll take and use those to train you in greater risk-taking for him.
Amen.
God bless.